Today I'm going to be talking about Dutch artist Johannes or Jan Vermeer. He's known as both. And Vermeer is very, very popular today. In his time, he was pretty popular, but there definitely has been a resurgence of interest in Vermeer's painting. Part of it is the mystique of him. We don't know a lot about him. We've been able to fill in some of the blanks based on archives and guild records, but there's really not a lot of material on Vermeer. So he had many, many children, but I'll get to that. And he produced very few paintings annually, usually 2 or 3, and that would be about it. He painted very, very small, very, very meticulously, probably using a small brush most of the time. And I will also put in a few video clips on him as well. Again, there's some argument as to which number is the provenance or accepted provenance of established Vermeer paintings. But basically, he painted just over 30 paintings, some say 34. In other words, sources are varied. Now this is details of paintings, and one of which they believe is a self-portrait. But you can see just how interested in light he was. The details are just incredible. One of the features of Vermeer is that a lot of the items show up over and over and over again in his imagery. Likely, it was things that were around his studio. So these are early works of Vermeer. If I was to see this in a museum and look at it and look at the subject matter and look at the style, I don't think I would recognize it as a Vermeer. This is not Vermeer when he has developed his oeuvre, his style, and this is biblical. It's based on the story of Martha and Mary. And it is that moment where you have sisters, one's working hard and one is sitting at the feet of Jesus listening to him talk and enjoying his presence. Again, the other one's busy, making sure everything's getting done, serving their guest. And one is getting more and more resentful of the other one, who's just sitting there, basically, listening to their guest. And if any of you have ever hosted a gathering, that is one of the conflicts of being the host, is that part of you wants to be right there, making sure everyone's having a good time, talking to everyone, but then part of you wants to also make sure everything is going right and dishes are getting done and things are getting cleared. And so usually in real life, it's a balance of the two that works. But this is that conflict between two sisters. One's doing the work and one is just sitting. And in this day and time, women worked hard, as did men. They didn't get a day off. They didn't get a weekend off. Every single day they were working. So this is Christ in the house of Mary and Martha. And it's, again, right in the middle of the 17th century. So again, he's known as a genre painter. Everyday scenes. Around this time period, 17th century, we're starting to see secular paintings coming out, which means non-religious paintings. Those were definitely something that were fairly new. Before that, most paintings were basically religious, things that had been asked for from various churches, particularly the Roman Catholic Church. And so these commissions were, of course, the bread and butter of a lot of artists. And anyway, let me move on. So again, this does not look like a typical Vermeer. Now, biblical works, historical works, huge monumental works, these were kind of considered the top of the painter hierarchy, and we call them, it's basically hierarchy of genres. So if it was biblical, if it was historical, and very detailed, these were things that were really, really admired. And so genre works were not as exciting, not in this time period. And certainly um, these genre works were things that people saw every day. So largely they thought, well, why should that be interesting? But in any case, the genre works were certainly coming of age in the 17th century. Rembrandt did them, other artists did them, Frans Hals did them, and so you certainly see that. So Vermeer loved strong color contrast. You'll see a lot of blue and golds in this lecture, rich reds, and these were things that he particularly liked to use. Now this is a larger work than usual. Most Vermeers are pretty small and very, very detailed. Also, an early work. Again, I think here he's trying to find his voice. He's trying to kind of figure out his place. He's probably getting some training. We do not know exactly where he was getting his training, but we do know that he did belong to the guild. So early work, again, not recognizable as a Vermeer at all. Diana was the goddess of the hunt and the personification of chastity, and she often had her companions around her, her maidservants, and they would move about as a group. And nothing good ever happens in art history if you come upon Diana and her handmaidens bathing, or bad things happen, because again, she's a goddess and you're not supposed to gaze upon her. So in any case, there are many paintings of Diana, and this is a mythological painting. So some of the things that we do have documented are his baptism, marriage, burial, and he only lived to be in his 40s, which I'd like to say that was unusual, but it really wasn't. Life expectancy was significantly less than it is now. But the idea of the artist and the artistic persona was only really starting to develop here, where you're starting to have guilds, where you're starting to not simply be a craftsperson, but to be an artist. And so here are some signatures and different variations that he would use. And so Vermeer was a name that the family ultimately adopted. And again, I'll give you some additional clips to support this lecture as well. So he did do a few landscapes, very few. If you happen to love Vermeer, I definitely would recommend the website Essential Vermeer. It's exceptionally good. It has a lot of details. And again, I think it's pretty well researched. So the only two works which feature only monograms are the largest, View of Delft, and one of the smallest paintings, Girl with a Red Hat. And these were part of, Girl with a Red Hat is definitely more part of his style or his oeuvre. And oeuvre basically means the style of the artist, its signature. Here, according to ArtNet, which is actually a pretty good resource as well, 35 paintings are attributed to Vermeer. So you can see that it's one of those things that is important to check several academic sources, because you're going to get several answers. So again, if I was writing a paper on this, I would talk about there are over 30 extant works by Vermeer. Then you're covered. So this is a View of Delft, and they have suggested that this is also mid-17th century. And so this was where Vermeer was from. And here you can see the exceptional details. Girl with a Red Hat. This is a fairly famous work by him. And as I mentioned, he had a number of children. And he didn't have a tremendous amount of money, although he did have a mother-in-law that had some wealth. He had a wife, he married into some wealth. But being that he did not have a constant supply of money, it's highly likely that his models were children, maybe neighbors, But again, especially young girls, those show up a number of times in his works. So it leads me to believe that they are indeed his children. Plus, a lot of them look alike, as you'll see. So I think this particular one, when you put what they believe is his self-portrait right next to it, you can definitely see some familial connections that indicate that it is highly likely that this is indeed a daughter. Pearls show up a great deal in his works, and I think one of the reasons why is because of the reflective quality. And they were popular, and they were also a luxury item, a symbol of luxury, kind of excess for that matter. But he uses it to basically demonstrate light. So there's all these reflective qualities, just this tiny bit of white light, this just a bit of white heightening that's all around that ruffle that is around her neck. So it's these details that make it quite mysterious and really quite gorgeous. So he was baptized in 1632. The family name at that time was Voss. Family kept a successful inn, so he was trained as an innkeeper. And we don't know where his training came from. Some believe it was from Carol Fabricius. But again, they're not entirely sure. His father was a member of the Craftsman Guild, and so possible he had some training there. And like many artists, he had more than one trade. He had a lot of children. His wife said to have had 15 pregnancies and 11 surviving children. That's a huge number, especially if you only paint 2 to 3 paintings a year. So he wasn't exactly prolific. So, money would have been problematic. Now, his wife did come from a family that had a lot of property, certainly money. And so I think that largely saved them. Although later, when there was flooding and difficulties, she indeed came upon hard times as well. So ultimately they become Vermeer because his grandfather, who was a watchmaker, was forging coins. And so they wanted to separate from that connection. And so, especially back in that time period when a family name was very, very important. So this is Carol Fabricius, and so he was trained by Rembrandt, only produced around a dozen paintings that we know of. And unfortunately, died quite young, so didn't really fully develop as an artist. In fact, many art historians and art experts think that he indeed would have been one of the greats had he been able to produce more works. There was a huge gunpowder explosion in the town, and that was indeed how he died, because some bureaucrat thought that it was a good idea to store a bunch of gunpowder in the middle of the city center, and indeed around a third of the city was destroyed when there was a fire, and so did not turn out well. So we also know that he worked as an art dealer. This would have exposed him to ideas and styles, and he would have picked up some of these things. Gave his occupation as painter whenever he signed official documents, and when there was a war with France in 1672, his lands and his mother-in-law's lands were flooded, and so again they definitely fell upon hard times at that point. So this is a self-portrait of Carol Fabricius, which again he died quite young. So this is the street in Delft, and there was some mystery as to where this was, and fairly recently they found some archival information based on the doorways of what indeed what building this originally was, and they do think that they have traced it to being his aunt's home. And his aunt lived in a so-so area of Delft. She actually sold tripe for a living. So anyway, his family lived with Maria Thins. She was his mother-in-law, very wealthy. She was separated from her husband, which I think is really, really quite unique in that time period. His wife's family was Catholic and he was a Calvinist. Some scholars think that Vermeer may have converted, but we don't know for sure. So as a result of indeed incredible financial difficulty and his obligations to his family, I mean, he would have been in a deep depression. He fell into lethargy and lost his health in the space of 1.5 days and died. And probably had a fever, probably had some other underlying condition, but and indeed, it even could have been suicide. You would never have reported it as suicide in this time period. But in any case, he died in his early 40s. His works by the 1690s were held in high esteem, but they weren't in his lifetime. I mean, again, he was fairly well known, but people weren't exactly banging his door down trying to buy his paintings. Now, of course, they're profoundly valuable. This is Peter de Hooch, Maid and Child in Courtyard in Delft, and you can see some of the similarities in style of these genre works, these everyday scenes. I grew up in a community that was not very far from a Dutch community, and there was a lot of pride in the way your doorstep looked. Everything had to be extremely clean. Culturally, there was definitely an interest in that, and certainly you can see that that was definitely part of their day-to-day life. Was you see the cleaning implements, you see the mother, you see the child, and so it definitely reflects on 17th century culture. Yet another landscape, but he's not really known for his landscapes. I mean, they're beautiful, they're very detailed, but he's not really known for his landscapes. I think this is highly likely that it's Vermeer's wife. Do we know for sure? No, we do not. Could it be an older daughter? Possibly. Could it be a neighbor lady? Absolutely. But again, I like to believe it's his wife. So this is Woman in Blue reading a letter. So again, they had 15 children. 4 died again young or in miscarriage, and so a total of 15 pregnancies. This is highly likely this is who he's depicting here. She spent a large part of her life in pregnancy. And this jacket was a fashionable jacket for the time period because, again, the family was pretty affluent. Her mother, again, was a huge property owner. And this is what's called a farthingale jacket. And again, very fashionable. Now, the palette here is very much part of the Dutch style, which is lots of blues and cobalt blues and golds and yellows. And that's kind of what is a traditional a Dutch palette. So Woman Reading the Letter, this is 1660s. And again, it's this quiet, introspective image. You have light streaming in from the left. Now note, almost all of the time, light is streaming in from the left. There is a poetic quality to a lot of his works, a certain almost magical quality to his works. The details are just incredible, very, very realistic. But there's one thing that I think is common to most Vermeers is there's this absolute serenity. In the background, you have a map, and maps would have been pretty valuable in this time period. And he loved maps. They show up in a number of his works. And over and over and over again, you see the same items if you really, really look. Now, This is an example of the Utrecht Caravaggisti, and these highly detailed genre works were something that was basically coming in from Italy, this idea of painting genre works, everyday scenes. And the ideas of the Utrecht Caravaggisti were spreading. This is Gerrit von Honthurst, A Soldier and the Girl, very provocative for 17th century. There is a didactic, teaching, moralistic quality here. This idea that this young girl is lighting a taper, and she's lighting this candle, and the light is what is incredible in this work. And it's also something that Vermeer was a master of. And so you see this light, this reflective light that is coming basically right on that focal point, which is, of course, the young woman's breast. And then the soldier was kind of playfully leaning over her shoulder. And again, there is kind of a idea for, beware, keep moral. There is a underlying moralistic quality, but they're also playful and fun. This is the Procurus, and remember, this is the work that has what we believe is a detail of the artist, a self-portrait of the artist, according to the experts. So he was 24 when he produced this work. Yellow was symbolic of distrust, questionable morals in the 17th century. There was some symbolism attached to yellow in the 17th century. And certainly here, the Procuress, which is a young woman who is taking money for her favors, a prostitute. And so she is sitting there, and of course, you see that money is changing hands literally. Her hand is out there. And then you have the soldier behind her that has his hand over her breast. And then you have the Procuress. She is the woman that's basically making the deal. She is the older woman that is behind that man. And then you have what we believe is Vermeer looking out at us. The only other portrait we see from his back. But based on the clothing style and some of the little tiny vestiges of details they've been able to put together, they do think that this is a self-portrait. Now, I think it's interesting. Do you see the large artist beret? Again, I could do a whole lecture on artist berets and when those started showing up. But you do have that kind of artistic persona. His clothing is a little bit flamboyant, and so it's playful. So Dutch painters wrote next to nothing about themselves or their work, since most considered themselves artisans. This idea of truly being a master was something that was just starting to develop. There was just threads of it. During the Renaissance, you start to see it more certainly. So the Dutch population was really not aware that they were part of the golden age of Dutch painting. Now, this is a detail of the art of painting. And that's a view of the artist. We also think this is a self-portrait as well. The hair is similar, the hat is similar. So artists often use an internal light source in a painting. You see this a lot with the Caravaggisti. And the Utrecht Caravaggisti, also known as the Dutch Caravaggisti, was a group that was particularly interested in using these tools. Georges de Latour was one of the French Caravaggisti. So the Caravaggisti were followers of Caravaggio. Caravaggio certainly was very, very influential in the 16th century and into the early part of the 17th century. But his ideas spread and spread and influenced a huge number of artists, including Rembrandt. So you often see a lamp, a candle, a window with shimmering light. Often in Vermeer's work there is this stained glass, and from uh, inventories, just try to think of that word, inventories, they have to kind of deduce that this one particular stained glass that shows up over and over and over again actually is the figure of temperance, and this stained glass actually belonged to a neighbor, and so it's something, a motif that shows up over and over again. And the symbol of temperance was something that was very much part of Dutch culture. Hey, it was a good thing to go have a glass of wine, ale, have fun, but moderation. Moderation in all things was very much a Dutch tradition. So detail of Honthorst, the Procurus. So this idea of the Procurus was a common motif, a popular motif, a motif that sold, so that it was something that painters were producing. So here you have that internal light source. And again, what is the focal point? It's that young woman's beautiful breast and neckline. And it's interesting too the way light is used here. You know, she is kind of has this bright light and he's in the shadows. And of course he is making a choice. And so they were a culture that was very much religious. There was a lot of conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. But even so, as a culture, they were religious and moralistic, and you do see these values come through on the paintings. And this again is that three-quarter view. You don't have a full figure, you have a three-quarter view of the figures. It brings the viewer up close and personal, almost as if you turn the corner and you see this happening. And that was something they wanted. They wanted that naturalism, they wanted that realism, and they didn't want it to be something elevated or, you know, biblical or historical. They wanted it something that they could relate to. So, and then this is the full painting. The last one was the detail. And here you can see the older woman. She is commonly used as a motif for the woman that's arranging payment, the John, if you will, or the Madam, if you will. But the Procurus, that's indeed what the word for it in 17th century Delft was. So this is Bob Buren's important work, and this was also a Procurus. And this was a work that showed up in inventories, and so we know that it belonged to Maria Thins. Now, it could have been a copy or a slightly different version. Remember, Artemisia Gentileschi did a number of Judith and Holofernes paintings, different versions, different styles, because again, it was a theme that was popular. And so the motif of Procurus was one that was of interest. It was moralistic, it was fun, it was playful, and it has a didactic or teaching or moralistic quality to it. You know, basically a reminder to young women to not, you know, fall from grace, preserve their virginity. And of course, you also see the Procurus, the older woman. Again, it's a type. And then the man that's kind of leaning into it. You have the figures that are a three-quarter view, very typical of Caravaggio works. And this was something that Caravaggio did. And it brings the viewer up close and personal. You almost feel like if you turn the corner, there you'd be. So that's one of the features, very naturalistic. And then in Vermeer's The Concert, you have the Procurus is on the wall. This is this reminder for these young girls to basically behave. And then you have the light source from the left, again, a feature of Vermeer you see over and over and over again. So there's certain constancies you are seeing. And then you actually have the instrument, though it is open, and then it's actually painted inside, really quite remarkable. And one woman is playing on like a harpsichord, and then a young woman is singing next to her. And then you have this man or this suitor who is there enjoying it. And it's playful, but it's also a triangle that's very similar to the triangle that's on the wall. The Baburin has this little triangular thing where basically a transaction is taking place. And in a similar way, the marriage of young women was a transaction as well. I mean, it was a business deal almost. And so you have this triangle here. You have these two young women, and you just wonder, which one is seeking the attention of this male, or are they both seeking the attention? But these quiet scenes are interesting. And then you have also the large instrument in the foreground that has been dropped, almost as if there was a fourth person that was participating and has stepped back. And so his works are really, really detailed. And again, look at the objects, look at the tapestries, the checkerboard floor. You're going to see that again. Hauntors, Baburin, Terbruggen. Again, they're doing this three-quarter view, very, very naturalistic. There are moral values that are being taught here in a painting, and they were again called the Dutch Caravaggisti or the Utrecht Caravaggisti. Honthorst took a trip to Rome and took a lot of the ideas back with him. And so the ideas of Caravaggio, his full name, Michelangelo Maurici da Caravaggio. A little chewing in the background is my puppy, and it's easier just to let her be. And so Caravaggio, this is, he's one of the followers of Caravaggio. Again, naturalism, that sharp, sharp chiaroscuro, which is light, dark contrast. Internal light sources, you see that candle that is basically shining right on the Christ figure in the bottom and a young girl in the top. And then you also have the Bacchus figure with a monkey. And this was obviously a young woman that had had too much to drink. She doesn't look particularly appealing. She looks sick. Her coloring looks sick. And it's a teaching device. It's a warning that have some wine, but don't have too much. Don't do this. And so in any case, these were some of the ideas of the Caravaggisti. So I actually have another lecture on Honthorst where I'll talk a little bit more about Honthorst, but Honthorst works tend to have a certain mystery to them, this nocturnal quality to them, and it looks very interesting. The lighting looks really interesting. So Gerrit von Honthorst goes to Rome and comes back with ideas. Most people come back with stupid souvenirs, but not Honthorst. He comes back with great, great ideas. And they change painting, and they change painting largely. The Caravaggisti also influences Rembrandt, and again, it's a game changer. So move on. Merry company. They think it's probably a wedding feast just because of how fancy the beautiful young girl looks, and there's a purity to her. She doesn't look like there should be a procuress standing over her shoulder, so they think it was a wedding feast. Behave. And there's that beautiful lighting. You see one candle, but obviously there's another one because you can see the light shining on everyone's faces. The lighting's really quite beautiful. So it's called Merry Company. Has this kind of beautiful amber light, this brown tonal quality. These are some of the traits of the Caravaggisti. And he did another married company that's, again, maybe not so much as a wedding feast. This one does have the procurus in the background. This one does have other things going on, so not nearly so tame. So message is definitely more clear. Eat, drink, be merry, but moderation is a good thing. But you can also see they're having a good time, and you can see why these would be appealing for viewers of the 17th century. You can see the contrast. Here's Mary Drinker and Ceiling at the Getty. You have to look closely to find this. This painting was there a while before I happened to notice that as I left this huge room with some beautiful Honthorst and a Valentin de Boulogne and some other works, that there's this little alcove, and just outside there is this painting that's on the ceiling, and it's exquisite. So don't miss it. It was down for a little bit. I think they were having it cleaned or something, but I believe it should be back up if the Getty is fully open. Now, Vermeer and other artists, Rembrandt, and I think there was Manet and others, there was an incredible art theft, and the reward is actually up to $10 million. The amount that these works are actually worth is in the billions. So this is the Gardner Museum theft, and it is pretty famous, and they haven't solved it. They have some pretty strong ideas, but no proof. So this work is called The Concert 1660s, and it was stolen in 1990, and it's still missing. So this work is valued at roughly 250 million. It's the most wanted artwork still missing, according to many sources. Again, it represents the Dutch golden age of painting. It's Vermeer's notable work. It's a little over 2 feet by 2 feet, larger than most Vermeers. And again, kind of a love triangle that is implied, but again, it also is kind of a teaching image as well, because in the background is that procurus, this reminder for young girls to stay pure. And he had a lot of girls. This would have been something that would have been a theme that would have been appealing to him. So music and lust were definitely interwoven themes that were often connected to each other. So sometimes music and dancing was viewed with suspicion. But I think the $250 million is an underestimate, frankly. And here you can see some details. This is a contemporary quote at the time that he was working, or shortly after he died. And there was an auction of excellent artful paintings among 21 extraordinarily vigorously and delightfully painted works by the late J. Vandermeer, representing several compositions. So again, he was fairly well known, but unfortunately his widow was able to hold on to very few works because of some of the debts, because there'd been a huge flooding in the area. So a painting is a world without change and without sound. Vermeer's paintings are full of musical instruments, people making music, reading letters. There are certain themes that are common to a Vermeer. Music is often present. And this also indicates there was musical instruments in this home, because it was a well-to-do home. His mother-in-law, Maria Thins, lived with them. And so they definitely lived well. And over and over and over again, you're going to see certain items. In fact, look at this particular coat with the ermine trim, this was something that shows up over and over, this fur-trimmed yellow coat. So it was obviously something that someone owned, and he uses it as a prop over and over and over again. Young girl at Virginal. Brad Burns' Procurus is again in the background. So in a number of them, you see the Procurus in the background. And so this young woman has a kind of intriguing look on her face, almost as if she's up to something. And then you have an instrument that's been put aside as if somebody has just left. So a visitor, some sort of admirer, you have a sense that there is a lot going on in this very young woman's face. Here's another example. You have this woman at the Virginal, and she's making music. It's hand painted, it's beautiful. And in the background, you have a Cupid figure, and he has a playing card as if he's about ready to trump something. And so he's basically referencing the game of love. And so this young woman also looks with a kind of knowing expression on her face. There's that window on the left-hand side, and there are your checkerboard flooring. So these were things that were probably in his studio. These are things he's painting. These are details he's painting. Yet another example. Here you see two figures studying music, maybe a letter, and again, there is this figure of Cupid in the background. It's not quite as clear as in the prior image, but it's also very much there as well. And so, and then the light streaming in, you see the chairs that also recur in his works, maps, but the lighting is what's beautiful. Perspective. He was really a master of perspective. So this idea that when you're looking down at a railroad, you know that the railroad stays the same width. Otherwise, the train would not go down the railroad. But if you look at it, it does this. And this is called vanishing point. And this is a feature of perspective. These are the sort of things that artists study to try to get right. So linear perspective conveys illusion of space, a sense that it goes in, and he has it down. Atmospheric perspective basically shows distance with changing color tones and details. When we're talking about atmospheric perspective, I think of Turner. Turner's work has a sense of depth, but it also looks kind of blurry, almost as if somebody has taken their hands and kind of blurred out the paint to add just a little depth to it. A lot of people think that he used camera obscura in order to get the details right. And so here you can see how it was done without electricity, mind you. And so it would have basically been reflected and with light coming in, and it basically projects that image onto the wall. And he uses those shadows to sketch it out and to get the perspective right. So a lot of people think that he did this. A lot of people think that this is tricky and it's an artist tool that's cheating or whatever. But again, these are some of the comments. But he painted in meticulous detail. So this is an example of camera obscura. And again, it is, I think it's highly likely he used some of these tools. It's too meticulous, unless he just had a really amazing photographic sense, which is possible. A Woman with a Lute, early 1660s, as well as duets and trios. Vermeer frequently paints solo performers, and again, almost without exception, women. Young women from well-to-do or good families should be accomplished. They should be able to play music. They should be able to sew. They should be able to read poetry. These were some of the things that a young woman would aspire to have those skills, at least in this time period, okay? There's that map in the background, and she's looking out that window almost as if she's expecting somebody to join her. But I think that's what's so fascinating about Vermeer, is you want to fill in the blanks. You want to know the narrative. You want to know the background. So I will try to remember to put a video on this particular work. There's a whole psychology of this particular work. Um, this has a lot of interesting details. Okay, there's that light source from the left, checkerboard table, perspective. Look at the mirror. You can see the young girl's face in the mirror, but her face is turned, and yet we see the straight back of her head, and yet in the mirror, her face is turned toward the male figure, almost as if she's looking down, but she's very much aware of that figure right next to her. So there's a psychology going on here. And that white picture, that's another thing you're going to see repeatedly in his works. The carpet tapestry that's kind of draped over the table, that's also something that is a feature of Vermeer. I think I mentioned that I grew up in an area that had a group of Dutch people that would actually lived in and around that area. And, you know, we had a Dutch baker that came by, and salty licorice. There was a lot of very European things that came into this neighborhood. And one of the things I do remember is I had a good friend whose parents were Dutch. She was Dutch, and their table was covered not in a tablecloth, but actually in a heavy carpet, much like you're seeing here. And so when I saw Vermeer's for the first time many, many years ago, it had such a familiarity to me because I was like, they do it too. So it's a Dutch thing. And so this idea of this beautiful kind of thick carpet tapestry being on the table was not uncommon. And then they put something else on top of that as well, sometimes like a thinner tablecloth. And again, they were meticulous. Here you can see some of the details. Again, the instrument has been put aside and she's playing, but again, very much aware of him on the side. So Honthorst again, he is working in 17th century. Paintings are often religious. Religion was still a central theme for many artists. And this is The Denial of St. Peter by Gerrit van Honthorst. And then that candle shines on that young woman's face as she's asking St. Peter, aren't you the one that was with Christ? And indeed, St. Peter denies Christ 3 times, which was, of course, was what had been prophesied at the Last Supper the night before. Christ before the high priest, 1617. So here we have Christ is brought actually before the high priest by the Roman soldiers. He was being questioned about his teachings because his teachings were very, very bold. That's an understatement. This work is one of the most famous paintings by Honthorst, and it was made in Rome, and it definitely shows that Caravagistic influence. So the brown tonal background, internal light source, chiaroscuro, and you have a 3/4 view of the high priest, but you have a pretty much full view of Christ, because of course the priest is sitting. It also has a lot of that psychology that I think is so interesting. The Christ figure is just kind of patiently listening and is not really reacting to the high priest that's basically telling him the law, and that he's basically breaking it. And so, under Jewish law, his claim to be the Messiah was punishable by death, and the book on the table contains this law. Calling of St. Matthew. This is by Caravaggio, and this is the moment when Christ and St. Peter actually enter this room. They argue about this room. Is it a tavern? Is it a counting house? Is it? They don't really know. They argue about it. But in any case, he comes in, he points to Levi, who becomes Matthew. There's actually a name change, but this tax collector, Levi, becomes Matthew. And Christ comes in and basically asks him to follow him. He points at himself like, who, me? And meanwhile, the figures around him, one of them is almost jumping up about ready to grab his sword. The other one is interested in what's going on. One is staring at the coins in front of him. He's more interested in worldly possessions. And then you have the figure in the glasses that's kind of leaning over, that really doesn't have an understanding about what's going on as well. Glasses, the first glasses would have been around 1400s. And so here he's basically pointing at him saying, come, pick up your things and follow me, follow my teachings. And so there's this spotty spiritual light that's really fascinating though. Some of the figures are lit and some of them are in shadow, like the one that's more interested in worldly possessions is in shadow. Christ, his face, should be really rather be unshadowed because he's kind of in the shadows, but he's not. He's lit. And then the hand of Peter is also lit. So it's got this spotty spiritual light that Caravaggio was well known for. This is yet another one of those beautiful, quiet portraits. These were called tronies, and they were something that was a specialty for 17th century art. This young girl was sweet looking, perhaps not the most beautiful, certainly not as beautiful as Girl with a Pearl Earring. That's one of Vermeer's most famous works. It's called Study of a Girl. But again, there is some similarity between the children. And I think you can make a pretty good argument that they are related. So again, the familial connection between so many of them is really quite interesting. Girl with a Pearl Earring, one of the mystiques of that painting is we do not know who she is. They want it to be a lover of his. We don't know. It's fun to guess, but we don't know. So this idea of a trony or a type of a person, not necessarily a portrait. A portrait is when I paint a portrait of someone I know. If I'm doing a person who's a type, then it's called a trony. It was basically, these were kind of popular types. And so here we have Rembrandt laughing boy, girl with the flute. And in Rembrandt's time, it wouldn't have been called Rembrandt laughing, it would have been called man laughing. The smoker, and so in any case, these are all examples of tronies. And the third one is a Vermeer, kind of an exotic Vermeer, I think. So you can see the difference between Girl with a Pearl Earring and Study for a Girl. So this is one of his most famous works of all. Now the book Girl with a Pearl Earring, it's not based on fact. It is fictionalized. I have had students actually try to quote from that book. No, it's fiction. It's not nonfiction. It's not a documentary. it's conjecture. It's fun, but I'm always kind of careful to read that because I don't want it to skew uh, my understanding of a painting. But the lighting is what's exceptional here. The dark tonal background, the beautiful lighting. This is classic Vermeer. So, but you can certainly see the connection to Franz Hals and this idea of portraiture, or in particular Tronies. This is something that he was definitely interested in. But just the little bits of white paint, this glistening white paint, make it so interesting. Now this craquelature, that's something that happens to older paintings, and in fact that's one of the ways in which they date a painting by its condition. Now they do try to restore it, but some of that is very much part of the nature of the painting. So certainly this is his notable work. So again, we don't know who it is. I think that's part of it. It's part of the mystery. Do we always have to have the answers to enjoy something? I don't think so. In 1881, Girl with a Pearl Earring was sold for just under 2 guilders. That's not very much. Indeed, Rembrandt's 100 guilder print was something that sold in the 1600s for that high rate, and that was an incredible rate, but 2 guilders is almost nothing in 1881. This is actually an artist that is appropriating this image, looking back to this image, and it is looking back to images like Vermeer's. Where Vermeer's girl wore a pearl for Linnea, a symbol of purity, Kirsten's young woman, Hendrik's daughter, wears household trash, and this is from Elle magazine, and they're showing the work of this artist. And so I think it's pretty wild. Nicholas May's Idle Servant, 1655. Uh, Nicholas May's poses the maid in a traditional position of acedia, the personification of idleness. Now that's something that is not really known to us, but it probably was known to viewers of the time period that would have recognized it. And so this idea of a servant just sitting there sleeping would have been something that was considered you know, very distasteful. And so you indeed have this woman, kind of basically presenting this servant like, see what I have to deal with. And then you even have the cat in the background getting into things. And of course, nothing has been put away. And then you have Vermeer's A Maid Asleep. So a generation later, still using some of the same ideas, and the same ideas of this serving girl just basically not working. But this has a lot of interesting details. Now, originally, there was also a dog and a man in the doorway. And so that would have been an entirely different reading. This idea that she was tired, a man's leaving, what's going on here. But it still has some subtleties. If you look very, very, very closely, in front of her there is a delicate little wine glass. This would have been a wine glass that ladies would have used, smaller. And then if you look right in front of the white pitcher, there is a glass that is called a rummer, and it would have been used for rum. And this is a man's glass. This is something men would have typically used. And so this large rummer glass is on its side, again, indicating that this man has just left. So you still have hints of that, but it's a little bit more open to interpretation. And so interesting details. You see that beautiful kind of exotic tapestry and the textures, and then you can also see the detail of that glass if you couldn't see it, because it was hard to see. So again, a number of his works have the same items over and over and over. This is a work that was very, very admired by Salvador Dali. And it's also done in those, what I would call traditional Dutch colors of blues and yellows and light blues. And then you see her doing this exquisite, very, very detailed sewing. So it's called the Lace Maker. So in any case, this idea of young women bettering themselves, it's a common theme. But again, my theory is he had a number of women and young women daughters, and this would have been something that was of interest to him. And it would have been something he would have had models for. A young woman sitting there sewing for hours is something that is a ready-made model for him. Salvador Dali, in one of his exploits, where he is at the Vicente's zoo, and there's a rhino, and then you have a banner of Vermeer's lace maker in the background, and then he's sitting there painting, sitting on a wheelbarrow. Again, it's Salvador Dali. It doesn't have to make sense. So he had many obsessions, two of them, Vermeer's painting the lace maker and rhinoceri horns, more than one. Intersected one day at the Vicente's Zoo in Paris. He arranged to copy Vermeer's lace maker for an hour in 1954, and yet he did not paint the figure. He painted rhino horns. With a crust of bread balanced on his head, Dali painted a study of rhino horns. Kind of divine from Dali's perspective. So, quirky, quirky, quirky man. So, and so here you again have that another example of that light source coming in, a large map on the background, and this is Officer and Laughing Girl, 1655. And she just looks a little too eager. I think that's one of the problems with this particular work. She just is, even to laugh loud was something that polite young women didn't do. So go figure, they had a lot of rules. Lady and a Gentleman, 1660. So, and here she's sitting there drinking. He's got his hand on the pitcher. He's encouraging her to drink more. You know, he's a good-looking man. She's a beautiful young woman. And then there's that window that is a stained glass of the symbol of temperance. There's a figure of temperance that is actually embedded in that work. And so this was a motif that shows up a number of times. Oh, and the checkerboard floor, there it is. And that unique perspective. You see that chair again, yet again, too. And so you can see the details. The fabrics, I mean, look at the way he did the fabrics. They're really miraculous. So this is, again, you have to look very, very closely to kind of see the symbol of temperance. It's a figure. It actually looks kind of cubist even. Lady writing a letter with her maid, 1670. The maid is looking away. A woman writing a letter indicates she may be having an illicit affair. Maids and servants often delivered letters from their mistress, their employer, not the other kind of mistress. The maid is often a confidant. This maid looks like she is distancing herself, looking out the window, or is she keeping watch for the husband or the father? So there are certainly more than one answer to a Vermeer, and I think that's what makes them very, excuse me, very, very appealing. Lady writing a letter. There's that yellow coat again. And she's got this very, very elaborate hairdo. So her hair has ribbons. She looks rather overdone, young, maybe a little frivolous. And then there's that beautiful pearl earring. And this time you can see both pearl earrings. But again, a young woman just writing a letter could be something that was conjectured to be illicit. Although, I don't know, this one I almost think is just a woman writing a letter, but who knows? So you can see the white highlighting that really makes it white, rather detailed. Mistress and maid, is there a narrative? I think so. You have a maid that's delivering something. She's kind of putting her hand up on her chin. She's hesitant. And so you have a feeling that this letter is of significance. So this one does make me think there's something going on. She's got a very elaborate hairdo. Again, those pearls were a luxury item, a symbol of excess. So, but again, young women absolutely positively do not accept letters from men unless they were betrothed. Really hard for us to understand. So, again, instruments, that left-hand mirror, those maps, letters, that coat, so many things recur. This young woman appears to be receiving news that is making her unhappy, or certainly very, very thoughtful. And so, and indeed, even this a dress that she's wearing, in another painting, the dress is blue and gold, but virtually identical to this one. So there's definitely some props that were reused. He's very artistically arranged the fruit kind of coming out of the bowl, symbolic of the fleeting quality of beauty, the fleeting aspect of time. You're only beautiful for a moment in time and things pass away. The fruit would be very symbolic in this work. So, officer and laughing girl. And the officer here is in shadow, and the men are often in shadow, which I think is interesting. They're not considered trustworthy, which leads me to believe he probably had more daughters than male figures, than sons. Her rosy cheeks indicate she's perhaps had too much wine. And maps in this time period were often, the land was done in blue, which is really, really odd to us because we do the complete opposite. So it's a complete reversal of what you think you're looking at. There is a kind of a dry lecture online about Vermeer's maps, but it's interesting if you happen to love maps. So here is a detail of this. And look at just the little tiny white dots on the edge of that chair. I mean, it's just so meticulous. So again, to kind of wrap up, what makes a Vermeer a Vermeer? Very detailed, careful rendering, extremely, extremely detailed, probably done with a very small brush. This is the opposite of the Impressionist. He is not doing little dabs of paint. It's very, very specific. Quiet interior scenes, interest in beautiful details. But again, this idea that it's didactic or teaching, checkered floor, maps, and sometimes, again, the paintings of paintings as well. Sigmund Freud once said, a dream that is not interpreted is like a letter that is not opened. So Freud inspired the surrealist. These odd juxtapositions were typical. Dali's After Vermeer, a woman receiving a love letter. It's interesting, the servant has this kind of egg head. And so, indeed, he did admire him a great deal. Now, Salvador Dali's work is extremely detailed as well. So they definitely share some traits. Young woman with a water jug. And see, here's that dress with more blues and golds, but it's essentially the same dress that you saw a few slides back. First version, under the second version. So the X-ray and pentimenti show changes Vermeer made, including moving the highly detailed map. I mean, this map was meticulously rendered, and then he decided it didn't quite work, so he moves it and repaints it all. Might he have had a little bit of OCD? I think so. This is the Milkmaid, 17th century. Vermeer over and over demonstrates a love and understanding of women. I think they're rather respectfully rendered. Certainly they're rendered in traditional roles, but I'd be very surprised to find he was a crap father. I simply don't believe it. He captures the women in his world, mostly would have been his family, perhaps a few friends or servants, but you see here that he is treating people respectfully. The details are what's incredible. You have these incredible still lifes in there. This is very much allegorical. In the background, you have a scene of the Last Judgment, and then she is holding this weight, and she's kind of weighing things. It's this kind of a weight of justice, and then she has her jewels around her, and so it's kind of taking the moral measure of your life. She's reflecting. You have a sense that she's pregnant, kind of a Madonna figure perhaps, or is she indeed contemplating her wealth? Because you have, of course, these luxury items that are kind of coming out of this jewelry box. It's been a work that's been written about quite a bit. But that palette, you have the traditional Dutch palette of blues and golds, but it's definitely allegorical and very narrative. This woman that's reflecting on life and morals and values and turning away from worldly things. So you can kind of see here the different views. We have certainly a more of a elegantly dressed woman compared to more of a serving girl. Now, there's some conjecture, is this the lady of the house, or is it kind of an upper servant, and they're not sure. Could be either. Girl with a pearl necklace. This girl is admiring her necklace in the mirror while there's stuff to be cleaned. Note the cleaning brush that's been cast aside. And so she's focused on worldly things, and pearls, of course, are a symbol of that. So X-ray shows map was originally in the background, but he took it out. And I think it's because it draws your eye most just to her, to the beautiful details. So women holding the balance, upper merchant class, and this would not be like an aristocrat per se, but upper merchant class. They're starting to have some level of wealth. Last Judgment painting in the background, as noted, quiet, still, weighing her sin, questioning worldly goods and its value. Light shading, gorgeous, simplified. The yellow ermine trimmed coat in blue. So it's not yellow, which would be more suspicious. Blue, of course, is more heavenly. So again, this idea of symbols would have been pretty well known. And again, there's a choice. This is also what we would call a vanitous image. All is vanity, this idea of a painting that has memento mori, symbols of death, symbols of how to live your life. This could be considered a vanitous image as well. Is the detail of it. Look at the beautiful hands. The way in which she has produced the hands in this picture are a wonder. Vermeer's Astronomer. This is at the Louvre, 1668. So here again you have these expressive hands and lots of geometry in this. And you have a globe. The globe would have been very, very valuable in this time period. Hard to even understand how valuable it would be. And so he has this these tools of his trade, and on the wall is a circular figure with radial lines. The moment of discovery is kind of on this astronomer's face, this kind of light of understanding, and he's so close to the window. And this is a little bit rare. This is a male figure. You haven't seen a lot of those, have you? And then again, the details here are remarkable. I've kind of zoomed in so you can see the details. The color indeed changes a little when you do. So I thought he looked like Richard Gere. I had to put it in, sorry. Some of my students are going, who's Richard Gere? Anyway, Google it. This is very similar. You have a muted palette, a limited palette. He's again really, really intent on this globe, which is showing up again. And this is called Vermeer's The Geographer. The details are really amazing. And I want you to look really, really closely at the book that's in front of him. Some scholar actually figured out what book it is. And so it is actually Vermeer that he painted. The attention to detail is quite remarkable. And this is by Adrian Matthias, and it's an interesting story. The scholar kind of fell onto the information almost immediately when he started researching books that were popular in this time period on geography. It was like immediately right there. So Vermeer, a mania for maps. This is a screenshot. So that is on YouTube if you have a mania for maps. It's kind of dry, but it's an interesting speech on Vermeer and maps. Perhaps one of his most important paintings, many people would believe so. You have the framing device of that drapery. You have the allegorical figure of history. So it's called the art of painting. You could also say it's the art of art history, essentially, because she's this historical figure. She's actually holding a book of history. And he's looking at this muse who has this beautiful laurel type headdress, which looks back to the classical past. And he's painting her, so it's called the art of painting. We're actually seeing the artist in his studio. The window is framed. You don't see that window, but it's coming from behind. Then you see the beautiful fabrication, you see the checkerboard floor, all of these things that make a Vermeer a Vermeer. But it's really gorgeous. So it's the painter and his model as Cleo, the muse of history. So, and they think this was probably a self-portrait of him. This outfit that he's wearing would have actually been kind of old-fashioned in its time period, but it would have been artistic. Got the beret there. Hitler acquired this work and it was ultimately returned to a museum in Vienna. The map shows the 17 provinces of the Netherlands. So here you have the artist is dressed particularly well, but again, not trendy. This is looking back to the past. The stockings are this really interesting, great pop of color that are unexpected. I mean, I would have thought he would have used blue or gold, but he doesn't. And the details over and over and over again are interesting. And if you look really, really close at that easel, it looks like it's missing a leg, or is the chair leg simply covering it? But that's one of the things artists and experts argue about. So I thought I'd end with some quotes. There is so much mystery in each painting, in the women he depicts, so many stories suggested but not told. And this is by Tracy Chevalier, who wrote the book on Vermeer, the fictional book on Vermeer, A Girl with a Pearl Earring. Almost all his paintings are apparently set in two smallish rooms in his house in Delft. They show the same furniture and decorations in different arrangements, and they often portray the same people, mostly women. And this was another quote by Konigsberger in 1977. But I think Vermeer's work is amazing, and I hope you've learned something, and thank you.